welcome to this music engraving tip. We haven't made a video in a long while, but there has been many good discussions on the Music Engraving Tips Facebook group about many topics in engraving, from hairpin length to beaming, pedantry abound. Today we're going to look at 5 simple tips that will improve your engraving right away. These tips, when followed, will quickly get your engraving to look more professional. Of course, the best way to a professional look is many months and years of study and practice, but these are some obvious things that you can do today. Tip number 1. Learn your shortcuts. Almost all music engraving today is done on computer, so it's fair to put this one first. When engraving in Finale, Sibelius, or whatever else, learn the shortcuts to the programs. It will speed up your engraving and even unlock features you didn't even know existed. You can also create some of your own shortcuts where default ones don't exist. Just as an example, in Sibelius I've set a few shortcuts for easily creating bar lines on the fly. I use the backslash and brackets as a sort of mnemonic for different types, as seen here. Try it yourself, and create some shortcuts of your own. You'll be glad you did. Tip number 2. Change the defaults. A score engraved on computer is only as good as the humans using it. Sibelius and Finale both have reasonably respectable results when using the default settings. However, when an engraver uses these default settings, it's easy to spot even with an untrained eye. Given the abundance of novice users on Sibelius and Finale, the defaults, by default, seem to have a less pleasant aesthetic. Often musicians can't quite put their finger on it when you ask them, it just seems off. Check out this example. The first is exactly Sibelius's default style. The second is using a font called Norfolk from Philip Rothman of NYC Music Services. Changing the music font is, by far, the easiest way to change the overall look of engraved music. I've also tweaked the margins and line thicknesses ever so slightly, and even changed the default text font. That classic published look, so-called, involves creating your own house style in this manner, carefully crafting your settings to achieve a certain look you want. Simple things like this can do wonders for your final look, and musicians will notice the difference. Try and play around with your settings, even going wild with them and finding a new look that you like. If you like, post it on the Music Engraving Tips Facebook group, and as a community we can comment and critique each other's settings. Music notation geekery at its finest. Tip number 3. Staves per page. Here's a more practical one. The number of staves per page varies on context, of course, but here's a few guidelines to keep in mind. Think of a standard individual part. These scores are usually at a 7mm staff height. In general, and this is going back to the old handwritten notation days, 12 staves per page is a good maximum, while about 6 is the absolute minimum. Add more and the page starts to get too vertically cramped, while too few and there's so much white space on the page that it just looks silly. Obviously, the smaller the staff size, the more staves you can add. There's no good rule, but you can easily get away with 15 staves per page at 6mm, and as many as 25 at 4mm. Of course, a larger page size will also allow more staves at a larger size. You're looking for a look that evenly distributes staves throughout vertically, without them being too cramped together. Tolerance for too cramped will vary, of course, but a good rule is to keep the spacing between the staves at least 6 spaces wide, but hopefully far more. The 12 staff example we just talked about has a generous 14 space gap between the staves, plenty of room for visual definition on the fly. Tip number 4. Use proper text alignment. One of the most obvious signs to poor engraving is bad text alignment. Text can sometimes be just as important as the notes in conveying meaning, so text objects should be treated with the same care as notes and staves. Here's some examples of good alignment. Tempo markings should always be flush left to the time signature. Lyrics should always be in a horizontal line for an entire system. Dynamics and expressions should always be aligned to the same baseline. Composer and lyricist credits should be exactly aligned vertically and horizontally on the right and left respectively. Instrument names should be exactly centered between their respective staves. Most of these are simply attention to detail, and once you make note of them, your engraving will look much cleaner and easier to read. Tip number 5. Masking to avoid collisions. Here's a really cool one, a technique called masking. Basically, you use a white background to bring out or hide a portion of an object to emphasize another. Let's look at some examples. In this case, the bar line is obscuring the text expression. In order to make it more readable, we can use a mask to break the bar line so it looks like the text is in the foreground and the bar line is behind it. In Sibelius, this is accomplished with the inspector, by activating the Erase Background function, and adjusting the vertical alignment and line height. Finally, it gets nudged upwards to align it with the dynamic. See tip 4. Here's another where a tie crosses a key signature. On its own, this isn't patently offensive, and it is obvious that this is a 3-sharp key signature with a tie around it. But say we want to remove that collision to make a more pleasing look. What about this? Or this? Or even this more ridiculous one? No, none of these are better than the collision itself, but we can try masking the tie. In this case, we would use a white colored graphic and mess with the order of the symbols to place the graphic on top of the tie. That way, the musician reading this still knows that the B is tied to the next one, but it isn't colliding with the key signature. Here's an extreme example of masking in a real-world situation that I had to do recently. In this case, a band piece, the horns and trombones are quite tight vertically and both have long hairpins. Unfortunately, this vertical closeness is complicated by horn 4 having downstem notes. So, as a compromise, I decided to mask the hairpin so it wasn't colliding with the downstem notes. Of course, in the part, the stems would be reversed, making the mask unnecessary. While this technique takes a little more experience to do, it can do wonders for your engraving in a tight spot. I hope these 5 tips can help you with better engraving. If you learned something, or you have any tips of your own to share, leave a comment or jump over to the Music Engraving Tips Facebook group. Ask for critiques, try out new ideas, argue about which music fonts pair with the best text font, and my favorite, Beaming. Thanks for watching and see you next time.